are children, and another third are veterans.
Yeah, I mean, there's there's huge segments of the homeless population that are completely hidden and that don't meet the stereotype and what people think about. But we have a lot of immigrant folks who are homeless. A lot of folks
I'm
who are
sure
doing
they
day
fall
labor.
right between the cracks. I mean, they don't qualify for anything. They probably have to remain hidden in the way ICE is conducting raids and
Yeah, exactly.
putting people in detention.
Exactly. And we have large numbers of people who are doubled up with other people who are kind of, sofa bed surfing, moving from place to place,
Right.
living in hotels. We have probably about 1,300 members of homeless families in San Francisco that are living in hotels. We have people who were living in abandoned buildings and cars, etc., all of whom really kind of remain hidden from the public view.
Right.
And, it ends up being really staggering. I mean, we did the homeless count last year, and the official homeless count from the city of San Francisco uncovered 6,000 and some odd homeless people, but did not count families with children, so you probably add in another 2,000 people at least there. Did not really count youth, and probably 2,000 to 4,000 people there. And we end up, once we look at all these hidden populations, we're talking about upwards of 12,000 men,
Right.
women, and children experiencing homelessness in such a small city as San Francisco. And so the housing crisis is getting worse, and the economy has basically created this whole new wave of homeless people.
Right. And talk a little bit about Mayor Newsom's project Homeless Connect. What is that doing?
Well, I mean, he called the project Homeless Connect, which, typically takes 2 months planning. And in this situation called it within, I don't know what it was, less than a week in Golden Gate Park. And it kind of went along with some media stories that were obviously pitched to the Chronicle and the Examiner, that there continue to be homeless people living on the streets.
And some in the park.
Living in Golden Gate Park, exactly. And that they had made all these efforts and still continued. People are refusing to leave Golden Gate Park. Of course, when you dig a little deeper on that issue, what you find is that very few of the people who were living in Golden Gate Park were offered real alternatives. It was quoted in the Chronicle today from the Department of Public Health that about 40%, so less than half, that they were able to connect with housing. But a lot of the folks who are living in Golden Gate Park are youth, and what they're doing is putting them in single-room occupancy hotels downtown. From the providers that provide services to the youth, and talking to the youth themselves, a lot of them have actually become in worse situations living in hotels downtown. For example, they're developing addictions to crack cocaine that they hadn't had before. Maybe definitely had some other issues, but it's kind of layering on another thing on top of that. They're very isolated. They've lost their sense of community and family that they've tried to develop. And most of these youth, of course, are folks who have been put out by their families, are victims of all kinds of different abuse,
Right.
physical and sexual abuse in their
foster care system
a
just
lot
throws
of people
people out
coming
at
out
18.
of foster care. Yeah, tons of people coming out of foster care. So, we're talking about unaccompanied youth who are really in a lot of in crises, and we're sending them into downtown hotels without a lot of support, where there's so very inappropriate housing that is being offered for the population for the most part.
Right.
And also this kind of
terrible areas like the Tenderloin.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what is happening is that as usual, poor folks are being used as scapegoats, by the politicians. So you have the situation where this myth of service resistance that really serves whatever mayoral administration that happens to be in power very well. That we are doing everything for homeless people. They don't want to do anything for themselves. Right. They're refusing services. We're offering them all these wonderful things, but they're right. insisting on living in
Blaming
the park,
the victims
where they
usual.
get rained on, cited, harassed by the police, spit on by the citizenry. That it's such a wonderful life out there in the park, living on the cold, wet ground. And that isn't this a joy? And of course, we all know human beings aren't meant to live outside, and that human beings don't enjoy that lifestyle.
Right.
But it's a myth that's constantly being
propagated.
And being promoted. And this Project Homeless Connect was really a political maneuver to demonstrate aren't we doing so much? And aren't they continuing to refuse?
Pretending to be
Yeah.
humane when there's nothing humane about 12,000 people living on the streets of San Francisco.
Yeah.
Or
And it
without
opens the door for
appropriation.
more civil rights violations, and
Of course.
that's really what the underlying tendency is.
I know. We need to open our live line. If you'd like to call in and ask Jennifer a question, please dial 415-621-4473. 621-4473. Let's talk a little bit about the actual shelters and what they provide and what the procedures are, what the MO is of a given shelter in the city.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought this up. I mean, the shelter situation in San Francisco right now is a very Byzantine system for shelter reservations. We have a situation where, of course, we talked about the thousands of people who are without housing. We have about 1,200 shelter beds for single adults, about 600 shelter beds for families with children, which basically serves about 200 families, a little less than that because we've lost some capacity. We also have...
it's grossly inadequate to begin with.
Right, it's grossly inadequate. There's huge competition. What happens is that people generally start seeking shelter at about 6 a.m. in the morning, sometimes earlier, and I've had folks report to me that they start at about 3 a.m., going to the reservation centers, camping out front, waiting in line, and they have about 7 beds that end up being released in that morning time that they're trying to get at any one site, and then they're sent away and they're told to come back, and then they come back. They're asked to come back at the end of the day, and maybe they come back and start lining up again at about 4 o'clock, again trying to get started front in line. Maybe if they're lucky, they get a one-night shelter bed, and then they have to repeat that whole process again. I mean, we're talking about on average, for folks that they're waiting 8 to 10 hours trying to get a shelter bed and then having to repeat that process on a daily basis. They're also going to the
it's no
shelter
wonder they give up.
Yeah, going to a shelter reservation at one site, being sent across, from 150 Otis, which is basically around Mission and 13th Street, and being sent all the way over to 5th and Bryant Street, which is a struggle. And you have to remember, a large proportion of the folks seeking shelters have some kind of disability, mobility impairment, a lot of elderly people, a lot of folks who really have a difficult time. They're not being provided by transportation. The city again and again it keeps saying, well, our policy is to provide transportation, but they don't. And that's documented by public reports over and over again. And it's really a mess. And we've done a lot of work over the past year, much